Inside the Bible, Episode 2, Genesis. We have with us today Nick Morrow, Brandon Edney, and Paulette Taylor. Well, Brandon, we're going to begin with you. You're back with Marvin Sweeney. So what'd you learn this week?
I learned from Sweeney's commentary on Genesis just an overall overview of the basic theme of the book, which is establishing Israel as a nation. It was written during the time of the exile, so it was a time to establish a national identity through the book and to kind of defend God as the creator and ordainer of all creation amidst the Gentile foreign religions and theologies of the Babylonian Empire. What I thought was most interesting was the emphasis that Tanak puts upon Jacob's relationships with his families in order to predict the future struggles that the nation of Israel would face. For example, Laban and Esau represent Aram and Edom, which would be nations that oppress Israel, and those relationships wouldn't necessarily be resolved until the 9th and 8th century. So I just thought it was really interesting and learned that not only are these stories from Genesis to be looked at relationally to tell about the characters, but that they actually represent nations and future interactions that are going to happen that Israel will face in the future.
Thank you. Well, Paulette, this week you had 3 writers, Susan Nidage, Ann W. Stewart, and Elaine James. What did you learn from reading this section of the Women's Bible Commentary?
In looking at the narrative that happened between Sarah and Hagar, I learned first that there are many interpretations of who Sarah represented and who Hagar represented. And this story, throughout time, different persons have taken a different look at it, from seeing perhaps one as virtuous, the other as evil, as she represented nations. Each one of them represented different nations. So there have been several national groups, if you will, that have tied their lineage to this narrative and to the way that it worked out and seeing how God provided for them. And I thought it was very interesting as far as how they all depicted that.
Okay. Well, Nick, this week you're introducing us to Rodney S. Sadler Jr. in the Africana Bible. So what did you learn this week?
Well, Rodney Sadler Jr. lists 2 very interesting aspects concerning the interest of Africana peoples in the book of Genesis. The first is that Africana peoples maintain an unparalleled belief in the Imago Dei, which is basically that all humanity is created in the image of God. This even extends to slave women, as seen in Genesis 16 with Hagar, and God's compassion to her. And Genesis 1:1, which is male and female, he created them, showing that together they were created in God's image. And the emphasis on equality likely comes from the Africana people's history and the mistreatment throughout Euro-American history. The second that I noticed is that they gleaned a lot of hope from the Joseph narrative. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, underwent years of mistreatment, only to rescue his same family members from famine. And they would, Africana peoples would glean from that throughout the years, and they would cling to hope that God would use their suffering for his greater purpose.
Well, Brandon, coming back to you, what questions would you ask of Marv Sweeney?
I'd ask Sweeney why he put so much emphasis upon God's character being questionable in his relationship with Abraham. Sweeney really depicts Abraham as being faithful and righteous throughout the acts of promises to have Isaac as a son. And he questions God's character if he'll actually come through with his promises, and I thought that was interesting. because through the text you see Abraham and Sarah not walking in full faithfulness. So if I were to question anybody, I would question Abraham's character rather than God's.
Seems that here, Sweeney is doing something that probably is more acceptable in Judaism than in Christianity. And accenting that sort of give and take between the two. You're very right that one of the things we see with Abram is he's given a promise and he immediately does things to sabotage his own promise. And that becomes an arc throughout the book. And so you're right, Sweeney, by accenting the relationship as opposed to the righteousness of God, does give us a different sort of read. Thank you. Well, now, I think you really focused on Sarah and Hagar, which was the Elaine James piece.
Yes.
What questions would you have for Elaine James?
Well, actually, I love Brandon. Would have a question as to what were her thoughts as to Abraham's treatment of allowing Sarah to deal so sternly with Hagar. That part to me was pivotal. I did not, and I still would like to know why he didn't step in a more decisive manner to protect her after all. But he didn't, so that would be my question.
Okay. One of the things for us to remember is that in antiquity, the concubine was meant to provide children for the house, for the purpose of the household. So while this Sarah, Hagar, Abraham story strikes us as quite unusual, for that culture, it would have been pretty typical if you were wealthy enough to have wives and concubines. And second, one of the things that happens, there's an interesting book called The Social World of the Bible by Matthews and Benjamin. And he looks at various social roles. Looks at the woman, the sort of mother figure, who is not the head of the house, but sort of the matriarch. And it is in the portfolio of the matriarch to make sure that there are sufficient children to get done what the family needs to get done. And so the Sarah Hagar story is a pretty typical story for that class. So what's up with, what questions would you have for Rodney Sadler?
I have two questions. The first is Dr. Sadler mentions a poem by James Weldon Johnson entitled The Creation, and it likens God to an African-American mother bending over her baby. And Sadler puts it this way. He says, "It is this God that toils over a lump of clay till he shaped it in his own image." So my question is, how dangerous is it to start ascribing female traits to God? And could this eventually lead us down the path of goddess worship? My other question is where Sadler starts to say that we need to approach Genesis with a certain hermeneutic suspicion because of the character flaws in the patriarchs. So you have stories like and you just mentioned this a little bit, but talking about Hagar being forced to be intimate with Abraham. You have Jacob, who loves Rachel so much that it neglects Leah, and Leah's trying to earn Jacob's acceptance by having children and doing other things. So what Sadler tries to say is that we need to not be willing to valorize these people. So my question here is, can we remedy this dissonance by choosing to see God as the protagonist and the patriarchs as the heroine who are in constant need of rescue?
That's a good way to put it. The hero of the book is God. However, you don't get a story without someone to cause complications in the storyline. And so the ancestors provide a great number of complications. And we'll get them depicted as sort of week in or week out, creating problems that need to be resolved, getting from the promise to Abraham to the resolution of the promise to Abraham, which is going to happen not really until we get to the other side of Joshua. So you're right, there is that movement back and forth, so that no one is quite right. And Sadler points out that it's largely only in hindsight that we valorize Abram and Sarai and start to forget that they're really complicated characters. And had they not been complicated characters, then lo and behold, it wouldn't be the same story we had. Well, it seems like time goes so quickly. And we're at the end of another episode. So I want to thank our guests, Brandon, Paulette, and Nick. I'm your host, and we'll see you next week when we look at Exodus. Now, if you have any questions,